Welcome again. Thank you all for joining our webinar on navigating iOS retargeting. I'm Margot. I'm head of content at Addictive. And at Addictive, we fuel the app ecosystem by inspiring users to engage with the apps they know and love. Specializing in user retention, we grow in-app revenue and build user loyalty with custom retargeting and churn prediction campaigns. This webinar is part of our Retention Club series, where we're bringing together players in the app universe to share and learn about all topics user retention. I'd like to give a special shout out to our marketing ops specialist, Bhavya, who's going to be running everything on the back end today. But I will also start with some introductions. So I'd like you all to introduce yourselves, give us a little elevator pitch of your experience and also a fun fact about yourselves. So maybe Clément, we can start with you.
Hi, thanks, Margot. Sure, so I'm Clément. I've been at Addictive, and this has been my whole experience in ad tech for close to 10 years now. So working in different roles, usually linked to the data side, and then expanding to operations as a whole, including solution engineering, as well as overseeing the creative department at Addictive now.
Perfect. And Niv, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. So I'm Niv. I'm a product team lead at Appsflyer with the company for the last 6 years or so. Appsflyer is a marketing measurement company that I hope everyone knows. I lead audiences and incrementality products, with audiences being our audience segmentation, measurement and activation tool, and incrementality being a lift measurement tool as well. Good to be here. And I guess a fun fact would be that I play drums, not enough, but sometimes.
Amazing. Thank you. And Dan, tell us about yourself and what's your fun fact as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm from Papaya Gaming. I'm in the company for the last 4 years. I'm managing the performance group here in Papaya, which is taking operation of the UA, retargeting, and organic activities within the company. Fun fact about myself, I love to scuba dive, and I have an issue with my ears a lot of the times when I scuba dive, so it's not that fun or funny. When
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
What's the coolest thing you've seen while scuba diving?
Oh, I've been scuba diving pretty much with around the globe, but the most interesting part was the Galapagos.
Oh, yeah.
So I've seen whales, sharks, turtles, sea lions, so pretty much a lot. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. And on to iOS. So I'll go over our agenda for today. We just have the main points we're going to be covering. We're going to go over how rising opt-in rates are affecting retargeting, different strategies for retargeting on iOS, so deterministic, probabilistic, what's the difference, and how do you include user consent in that conversation? Striking a balance between successful campaigns and compliance, so making sure that your campaigns are optimized and doing well, but still remaining compliant. So those are kind of our main topics, but I'd like to get into the current landscape of retargeting on iOS. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Niv to cover, opt-in rates, ATT, adoption, and all of that good stuff. So Niv, I'll hand it over to you to start.
Thank you. So maybe just to put us in some context. So as most of you know, around 3 years back, Apple brought the big news of essentially enforcing consent on iOS retargeting in that context of ours, but actually the consent is for sharing the iOS device identifier. So each device has its own identifier, and it is being used for targeting in general, also retargeting and also measurement. So we saw it influence across the board. And we saw a lot of change since that moment 3 years ago, that different people expected to play in different ways to where we are today. So to begin kind of the flow step by step, there's even showing the consent. Okay, so there's a message that Apple demands to show to users, do you allow tracking, and so on. And the reception for that was a I would say, quite cold from the industry. Some were even afraid that it will hurt UX, user experience altogether, were afraid to even show it, and so on. Wait, I think I missed the slide.
Oops.
No worries. So one back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So fast forward to today, we actually see 84% of gaming developers and 68% of developers in general showing the prompt. So the vast majority is thinking that it's worthwhile to receive consent and are also optimizing consent. We see that in a bit. This marks an increase from where we began, 16% and 40% respectively. So the first headline for today is that most app developers today are showing consent. If you still have concerns, you can advise with the experts on how to do it properly. There are a lot of guides out there, and it's being done quite effectively. You can go to the next slide. The next step in the user funnel is obviously, one back, sorry. The next step in the user funnel is obviously how many users are hitting I agree or I accept tracking in April terms. And also there we had very dark predictions. No one will hit this prompt and so on. And even before I say numbers, although they appear on the screen, I just want us to look at this within the context of messaging in general. Okay, so when we look at how many users consent to receive emails or push notifications, which essentially are the only ways to reach your user base outside of the app, actually these numbers look even better sometimes than in the other channels, and they are a very significant revenue stream. Today we see at a global scale 50% of users agreeing to share disagree. Gaming specifically looks very similar. And then when we check, okay, so advertisers are showing consent, they get consent from users, they might still not invest in retargeting, which is essentially targeting existing users, right, to get them, to re-engage them and get them back to the app. So there, as expected, we saw a huge drop following ATT. So if before ATT, 36% of advertisers in Appsflyer specifically used or had a substantial retargeting activity, not just UA campaigns going sideways, but actually investing in retargeting. And that's only for paid media, by the way. We also have own media, email push notifications that would look a bit different. I'm still with the previous slide. So we saw a huge drop, 40%. However, we've already overcome that, jumping fast forward to today, and 39% of advertisers are fully engaged with retargeting, which is even an increase from what it was before. Now, the last thing I would share here is, okay, so advertisers are showing consent involved in retargeting, but let's look at the sheer volume. How many conversions are caused by users clicking ads, viewing ads, navigating back to the app? So there, as well as expected, huge drop in iOS right following the changes. 70% less, 60% less for gaming specifically. But again, with improvements in technology, in measurement, in different things, we already see a lot of increase. We might have lost the presentation again.
Yeah, I think we might be having a little technical difficulty, but that's okay. Okay.
So overall, we see not full recovery. We're still in iOS specifically, minus 25% from the pre-iOS state. But for gaming specifically, we actually saw growth. So not only we've closed the gap, but we see reignited growth, more and more adoption. So that would be kind of the high level summary from my end.
Perfect, thank you. So Clément, how does this match up with what we are kind of seeing as well on the retargeting side?
Yes, I think this definitely echoes what Niv is saying, honestly. So we did see obviously a big drop in retargeting activity post ATT, with obviously a lot of I would say there were two different attitudes. Some advertisers saying like, okay, we'll still continue to invest while we figure out all the tracking and what's going on for iOS. And some who were maybe on the more cautious side who were like, okay, we're going to stop investing on iOS and shift all the budget to Android, at least on retargeting, because at least on Android, we're sure we're having the visibility, etc. And now we definitely saw an increase in the past months. And to echo what Niv said, we see, I would say, more activity now than we used to see pre-ATT. So that's definitely a good sign that things are back on track. To give a couple of figures on our end. So we only work with companies who are interested in doing retargeting. So when the benchmark is comparing, are you spending on Android and iOS, or only on iOS, or only on Android? And we do see that among our clients spending on retargeting, approximately 60% are live on iOS. And if we look specifically at gaming, it's more 70% who will be spending on iOS. So quite a decent portion, knowing that some apps are not interested in iOS at all because they would be in some geos where iOS is not so developed. So that's an interesting point. The other thing that's also, I think, pushing a lot of advertisers to keep spending on iOS is the fact that we do see on average an average revenue per user that is 30 to 60% higher on iOS overall. So users are usually more valuable on iOS. So that's also definitely pushing to retain users even more on iOS when that's possible.
Awesome, thank you. And so I guess moving on to kind of the next question, I think, Dan, how is this affecting Papaya's kind of strategy for iOS in general, or is it affecting the strategy at all? I think you're muted, Dan.
Sorry.
No problem.
So as we and Papaya are mostly iOS-based company, we didn't have the luxury on that end to stop or to halt our iOS retargeting activities. So we continue throughout our retargeting campaigns. And I think that for some part, we even enjoyed the decrease in competition and the decreases in prices. I will take it to the previous slides that Niv displayed. We showed that there was a dip in the amount of competition or the amount of attribution and the investment from other companies. So we had a lot of different experiences, and so we tried to understand what works better for which audience, for which segment. So if we will have some tips on that end, I think is to understand your audiences, know your players on that end, and when to target them, which segment and how. And the other thing, I think that we can see a rise in deterministic and non-deterministic approach, because previously we would only target based on IDFAs, which was highly dependent on the consent rate. We can see the consent rate is increasing, but you still have, let's say, 60% of non-consent, which is an untapped or potential audience for that end. So you want to get those 60%. So we see more and more advancement in this field, where you try and get more and more of those, a higher share of those 60%, and the competition is rising there as well. So I would suggest focus on both ends, because those 60% are very important as well.
Yeah, and I think Niv, you got into it earlier too, but about how many marketers and how many companies are really taking advantage of iOS now. You guys have definitely seen a rise in that, as you mentioned before. I think you're also muted, Niv.
Yeah, so first of all, most companies kind of keep their strategies aligned between iOS and Android. So maybe they saw some drop in iOS, but they're not canceling out iOS even before. The only thing I can maybe mention is that sometimes iOS, if you don't have large enough audience at the end of the day, you might want to use a wider targeting. This also goes to the point of more of a probabilistic approach, but perhaps in Android, you can be super granular with how you personalize ads, and maybe in iOS to reach a larger segment, you'll go for the category or for some higher hierarchy. But overall, I definitely identify with what was said here.
Perfect. Yeah, and that brings us to my next question, which is about deterministic versus probabilistic strategies. So Clément, maybe you can give us kind of an overview of how those work, and what exactly is the difference between these two strategies, how they work together, etc.
Yes, for sure. So it definitely depends on the user consent. So I would say there are three types of retargeting that are possible. The first one is deterministic IDFA. So basically, the user opted in and decided to share the IDFA to the ATT prompt. So they basically allowed to be tracked and share their IDFA. So then you can definitely match this IDFA on the supply side to be sure you are targeting the right user. So it really works as it used to work pre-ATT, or as it is working currently on Android with the GAID. It's really the usual retargeting use case. And then there is a case of what Dan mentioned. What do you do when the user decided to opt out? So basically to say, no, I don't want to share my IDFA. I am not allowed to be tracked. So first of all, you need to tackle user consent, but I think we'll discuss that a bit later. But the question then is, okay, how can I find this user somewhere else? So there are two ways to do it. First one is working, especially if you are a publisher with different apps, where you can leverage the IDFV. So assuming you have two different apps, app A and app B, you might have a user with a given IDFV that has opted out of app A, but they have given their consent and opted in for app B. So then thanks to IDFV, you can actually match this user and actually retrieve the IDFA for this user, even for your app A, which is the one you want to do a retargeting for. So it's really deterministic because thanks to the IDFV, that's really deterministic information, you can actually find the IDFA of this user and target this user really according to this IDFA that you found. So it's really deterministic in that case, using IDFV as an intermediary to match the user. So it's really a good one. And then assuming you can't match thanks to IDFV, then you need to rely on other means to try to target the user. So then you're going to be relying on other data points, which is what we call the probabilistic retargeting. So usually it's a mix of additional parameters such as IP address, device models, OS version, things like that, in order to try to find a common key and to retrieve those users and target them basically. So that's really the three different ways to do retargeting. The first one is deterministic IDFA as it used to work before when user says, yes, I want to share my IDFA. And deterministic IDFA and probabilistic is, let's say, a way to expand a little bit on your user base and target users who initially opted out of ATT and did not allow tracking. But again, you need to make sure about user consent, which is something we will tackle a bit later, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will get to consent for sure. So Dan, I wanted to pass it over to you because I'm curious how Papaya's, what's the mix at Papaya in terms of how you guys approach iOS retargeting campaigns, deterministic, probabilistic, etc.
So I think that the key is basically try to get it all, but there are like, as you show here, there's few different approaches here. If I have the IDFA, first thing I will work on the top of the funnel to get the consent rate up, so I'll have more and more IDFAs for that matter. So this is the safest, the most accurate wise, because we have the IDFA, so we can match the device and on a deterministic way. So IDFA is the base for the retargeting activity. On top of it, we have the probabilistic activity where we try to target all the non-IDFAs. And the other side of the probabilistic on some level is the IDFV activity, because this is also available on some level, mainly on cross apps. And then you can either get the some modification or some levels of higher probabilistic, let's call it, of the users to return. So we're utilizing all those three approaches for a more holistic view and try to get more and more or a higher share of our potential audience on that end. The bigger the audience and the bigger potential for us to retain those users, make a very big impact on our prices, as well as like the amount of users that we are able to draw back to the app.
Awesome. So yours is, you would say, trying out kind of a mix of all three of these strategies to kind of achieve like your iOS goals, basically.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And so I think, Clement, we can get into compliance. So how do you recommend marketers achieve compliance in their iOS campaigns? And from Papaya side, we'll get to it, but what is your strategy for compliance? But let's start with Clement.
Yes, sure. So compliance is definitely a super important topic. It all depends on the privacy laws, and the privacy laws are applicable depending on two things. Either I would say where the headquarter of the advertising company is based. And second, where the user are based. So depending again, if your user base is really global, you might fall under GDPR, for instance, for your European users. If the headquarter of your gaming company, for instance, is based in France, then everything would be applicable because you are in a GDPR country. So that's really the first thing is law. What is the applicable law for you? It might be also a CCPA if you are in California. So that's one thing. And then the very important thing to understand is if you fall under these privacy laws, then user consent is required. The thing is there are two different prompts or two different ways to ask consent. There is the Apple way, which is the banner or the prompt that you see usually when you open an app, which asks if you want to allow tracking or ask app not to track. So this basically what it does, it only covers IDFA. If you say allow tracking, your IDFA will be available, which is really nice if we want to do a retargeting afterwards. If you say no, your IDFA is null, and we don't know who this user is from an advertising standpoint. But that's really only for Apple. Like the privacy laws, they do not really consider this prompt because they think it's not specific enough and it doesn't really contain the information required for a user to make an educated decision. So then comes the consent banner, which are really the ones that are required by the privacy laws. So they are a bit more specific because they specify the targeting purpose. They ensure that the user consent is informed, is given freely. So usually there's a bit more text, a bit more explanation. There should be the possibility to accept all, decline all, or usually, to even go into the detail and accept only for some specific use case to share your data. But that's really the one banner that is important when it comes to be able to retarget user from a legal standpoint. So you definitely are allowed to retarget users who would say no to the ATT prompt on the left, but who would say yes to the consent banner on the right. And again, this is assuming the privacy laws are applicable, so depending again on the geo.
Yes, it's a good point about the difference between the two, because I think a lot of people don't realize, I mean, at least for us, as we are a European company, this is a big topic, and it always has been, but I think a lot of marketers don't realize that, okay, you have the ATT prompt, but also the consent banner is much more thorough, and it could be a different result with the consent banner.
Exactly. And we do usually see a much higher opt-in rate for consent banner. I think also because users are probably a bit more used to it. You see it also a lot on the web, typically. The Apple ATT prompt looks a bit different probably, so hence probably also the lower acceptance rate on that one.
For sure. And Dan, to you, I guess, how does Papaya kind of navigate the world of consent for opt-in on your side?
So I think this is a very important topic for us as an iOS-focused company on that end. So we focused and we invest a lot of trying to understand how we can increase our consent rate, so we can get like a better consent rate and better ability to retain those users potentially. So we did a lot of A/B testing, and we still try to understand what is impacting more and what is increasing more on the consent rate on our end, if it's by, let's say, for new users or old users, by their geolocation or by different segmentation on that end. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and so we'll shift gears a little bit. So I want to talk about trends in the field of privacy. I know that Privacy Sandbox is always top of mind for everyone, but we also now have the ad attribution kit from iOS. So Niv, if you want to take us through, where do you think we're headed in terms of privacy trends?
Yeah, so without getting too technical and keep this interesting, I would say that the main conclusion, at least from our part, is that not only we see the trend now increasing, we do expect it to grow even further from a few reasons. One is that the need is there. User acquisition costs are going up. The market is getting saturated more and more. Companies need efficient ways to reactivate their users, and there is joint interest here from the media companies, from the ad companies, from the advertisers, from the OS. So it all goes in the way that advertising needs to be done in a private way, but still, drive this ecosystem in general. So that's one. The second is that measurement is getting improved, including, by the way, the very good point that you've made, where Scan, for example, didn't even at the beginning, and still today, didn't even take retargeting, re-engagement under consideration at all. The interesting part that happened there is that the industry itself found the privacy-preserving technologies to just keep it going. Some companies faster than others, but the bottom line is that it is kind of a solved problem today, and it's only going to improve. So the ad attribution kit, also from Apple's side, is going to support retargeting. Also on the Android side, they even took it further to not only support measurement, but even do the entire flow of user activation directly from the device in a private way. So from the ground up, this new technology is being built to include custom audience creation, segmentation, retargeting. So in that case, we can be positive. Of course, it's gradual, and you're welcome to advise with us to understand maybe better over time where do you sit with your specific business. And the last point I want to make is that also, as we are aware, machine learning, AI, different ways of automation are improving, and I'm sure Clement can testify on his own that also the way to personalize ads is improving, meaning the user experience of users to re-engage with their brand is becoming better, which again will make them less opting out of similar consent and so on. So overall, I think we're at a positive trend, and I do expect it to continue.
Yeah, it does seem like things are moving up, which is not exactly what we would have thought in 2020, but great. So Clement, specifically, I guess, from the retargeting and re-engagement side, what trends do you think are going to affect us the most, or will affect marketers the most?
Yeah, definitely think that measurement is gonna change slightly and gonna improve. For Android specifically, it's gonna be really like a big change, as Niv mentioned, because it's really the whole flow that's going to change. So it's gonna require to adapt. I think the way Google is doing it is definitely much more gradual. So there will be lots of tests, lots of back and forth to be sure that everything is under control before the rollout. I would say for iOS, definitely different. It's really everyone figured out its own way to measure. We do see that relying on MMP probabilistic attribution, for instance, when you don't have the IDFA, is still an efficient way to be able to track and measure your iOS campaign. It's working. You're still able to allocate your budget, perform your optimization. So it's still definitely working. If Apple gives a better control, more elements for measurement, it's definitely going to be a big plus. I think it's really baby steps because, again, as Niv said, they started to mention retargeting. Now it's a bit more concrete with ad attribution kit, but there's a lot of missing pieces. I'm not sure also really about the deadlines. So I think we'll have let's say a good monitoring for a good 12 months at least to see like what's going on, and probably some changes starting to occur in the next 12 to 24 months. I guess is probably what is going to be here. In the meantime, I assume that companies such as ours are going to get better at trying to identify those opted out user, improve the efficiency of this probabilistic retargeting, trying to accurately figure out the right users, as well as everything linked to machine learning, creative optimization, and things like that. So yeah, a lot on the machine learning side for sure.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. And so I think we have another question about avoiding misattribution. So I think this was something we talked about in our planning call. But I think, Dan, we can start with you since you're the closest to, looking at your own campaigns. What should marketers kind of look for to avoid misattribution when running retargeting?
So I think one of the strongest tools here in order to avoid misattribution or to understand the direct impact of your campaign is the use of deep links, because the majority of the attributions from a retargeting campaign are basically re-engagement or users that reactivate and reopen the apps. So deep links should be supported on the majority of the attribution, and those should give a deterministic attribution. One point here that we should take into account, it's only available for click-through attribution. So you should take it into account when you evaluate the performance and add some view through and look like on the other areas as well, because this is not giving you the full picture. With that being said, the majority of the activities will still be based on click-through attribution, and it will support the deep links. As well as you can personalize your experience later on in order to give the user better experience and increase their potential to stay with you and to decrease their churn for that matter, and increase the retention for remaining LTV.
Yeah, Niv, I don't know if you had anything else to add from the MMP side or.
Just reinforcing the point where for retargeting, today, actually, it's mostly deterministic attribution, which is very accurate because, again, the deep links, I'm sure I don't have the exact number, but over 90% of it is deterministic because the users don't need to go through the walled garden of the App Store, essentially. They go from one app to the other directly through a deep link. My camera is off. Directly through a deep link. So the only gap, again, as Dan stated, is view through attribution, where this specific mechanism does not work. However, I'm not sure if we'll have time, but also advancements in causal impact measurement, incrementality, and so on can both validate the attribution that we do have and close the gaps on whatever area that is not attributed fully.
Okay, great. And so I think that is all for my questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. But my last question for you guys are basically any final tips for app marketers looking to enhance iOS retargeting? And Dan, I think we can start with you since you're the closest to it. You're on the app side.
Sure. So I think it will be mainly a summary of some different touched on some few different topics that we touched upon now. So I would start with segmentation, know who to target when. The second thing is personalization. If it's on the creative side or the app experience itself, when the user come back to the app, give him a good personalized tailored experience in order to decrease his churn possibility, because you don't want to pay for him again and again. That's another thing. And the third, I think, that is the deep links that we just said, because you want to understand which campaign and which activity give you the direct and the right impact that you are looking for in a more deterministic way, because in our world at the moment we have a lot of let's say uncertainties or different challenges in the world of attribution. So where it is solvable, you want to solve it as much as possible, so you know where to allocate your resources in a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Clément, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that the days where running on iOS retargeting was an easy opportunity because the competition was lower. Those days, unfortunately, are definitely gone. For sure, we now see that the competition is really really increased again. So probably the next still a bit untapped opportunity is more on the probabilistic retargeting side, because that's something relatively new. Not all companies are trying it at the moment. So if there was an opportunity to look into, that's probably where I would have a look. Otherwise, fully agree that personalization of campaign is really key. Good segmentation, aligning the creatives and their message, as well as the offers, if any, depending on those segments, is really super important for performance. And usually, as you get a bit more granular in your strategy, you do see a strong uptick in campaign performance.
Thank you. Perfect. And Niv, final thoughts?
I think the team here covered it perfectly. I can maybe just add again the point with measurement that again it wasn't so from the start with iOS, but we're in a very good position today of proving the value of retargeting. So in case you're skeptical, whatever, these users would have been doing it anyway. I'm not sure the cost, any kind of question you have is pretty easy today to prove. You're using the classic attribution, using a lift measurement, using different tools that are pretty common. So I would just say, when in doubt, just, pick a few strategies, give it a go, and it's pretty easy to measure the impact.
Perfect. Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions. So the first one is about incrementality and incremental measurement. So how can I optimize remarketing using incremental measurement, basically? So I think Niv, this is probably one for you.
Cool. So specifically for retargeting, again, because of the consent, you can create test and control groups at the user level and identify the difference between users that are viewing ads to users that are not viewing ads. This kind of closes the gap with users that are active in your app and might do all kinds of actions on their own, which is often the big concern around retargeting, right? So whatever, I'll take a classic example from e-commerce. People abandon the cart, but maybe they just went to advise with someone and they will go back and they will buy on their own, all kinds of questions like that. However, you can prove statistically that the similar group of users that are viewing ads are generating more impact, and you can say exactly what is the impact. This used to be a practice that was quite complex, Developers needed some BI teams, data science team to arrange that, orchestrate these tests, exclude users, and so on. But there is plenty of tools, Appsflyer included, and with the ad partners themselves. So plenty of tools to do this type of experimentation. And you're welcome to try it out and really prove the value and even optimize for the incremental impact, which is always at best.
So thank you.
Sure.
And we have a really what I think is a good one in the Q&A as well. So thank you for this question, but I think this is mostly for Clément. But are the consent banners and ATT prompt usually shown sequentially? Would acceptance rates differ if they were shown in different moments of the user journey?
Sure. So I can give my answer, and probably Dan would also like to share how they did it for Papaya. I would say that usually you need to give a bit of time between the different banners you are showing, just because if a user is opening the app for the first time and then you start, to ask them like, do you want to allow pop notification? What about the ATT prompt? What about the consent banner? It can be like 4 or 5 different pop-ups and banners in a row without accessing the content, which definitely is going to hurt your retention rate, which is especially very difficult to have a good retention rate post-install. So I think it's super important to phase it out a little bit and not do everything at once for sure. So that's one thing. We also even saw some companies do some pre-prompt. So basically a pop-up that would show just before the ATT prompt, which is actually really the important one, because that's when you know if the IDFA is going to be available or not, which was usually a banner which was basically explaining a little bit the concept of the ATT prompts and why it was important to say yes. If the user would say, yes, I allow to this pre-prompt, then they would show the ATT prompt. If the user would say no, then they would wait a little bit to show the ATT prompt. The important thing to know is the ATT prompt, you only have one opportunity to show it. You cannot try to show it, multiple times until the user finally says yes, which honestly makes sense. So yes, it does depend a lot on when and how you show it with a pre-prompt or not. And the acceptance rate are going to differ a lot. So it's really a lot of A/B testing back and forth. So I don't know how long it took you at Papaya to get the sweet spot you have now, but I assume quite a lot of iterations.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there is always like an perfect combination for that matter, because it really differs from the different audience type that you are bringing to the app on that matter, on that set of time of the test. If it's from the state level or from the creatives or from which apps for that matter. I do think that this is a lot of work, and to understand the subtle changes that you are doing, if within the timing of the order of the pop-ups or the colors or the coding in the text-wise, but this is taking the time. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely important to kind of optimize that time in between the two to make sure it works for your app. Along the same lines, I'm going to jump around a little bit because there's 2 more questions. Let's see if we can get to both of them. But in the same vein as the pop-up question, is the banner shown on an app or on the web only? I remember seeing the Apple banner when downloading a new app, but not the consent banner. I only remember seeing it on the web, they asked. So I think this is also very region specific, as you said, Clément. It very much depends where you're located. Maybe you can expand on that a little.
Yes, exactly. Honestly, you might see only one of the two, only the Apple banner, only the consent banner. You could see both, you could see none. It's really up to the advertiser to show the banners or not. If the company is compliant, you should probably see the consent banner if you are in a GDPR region, or again, depending on the geo. But again, as Niv said at the beginning, there's still a fraction of companies, for instance, that do not show the Apple banner because they think it's going to ruin the user experience. So yeah, all scenarios are possible, honestly. You could see one and not the other, both, none of them.
Thanks. Perfect. And our last question, I think, is for Dan. So did you run a proper A/B test with creatives? I think on iOS, they want to say. And did you see any meaningful and repeatable outcomes there? In retargeting, it seems that creatives often get the same result 19 out of 20 times.
Sure. So we had a lot of different tests on the creatives and the impact of the retargeting activities. Some were successful, some not. Some were more impactful than others. I can say that the most impactful ones usually that we noticed were the ones when we tested our, let's call it business as usual creatives against special, more time-limited offers, live ops creatives. We saw double-digit increases or changes between those two groups, which also make a lot of sense. But we do understand that the messaging and the importance of either time-limited or the, let's call it the emphasis on the message, price, time-limited, live op theme have a very big impact to return, as well as if you can also tailor it for the segment, it have a double dip on the increase. If you know a specific segment love, for our case, some special live op, and you can display it for him, you have a higher potential to retain him on that matter. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I think that we're just in time, actually. I think we're good. So thank you all so much for joining and for your good questions. I had a lot of fun talking to you guys. So I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much to Niv and Dan and Clement for joining.